Hello again, AP Psychology students, and welcome to what should be your last video lesson, at least for this week. Next week, I should be back in person with you guys, so I'm looking forward to doing that again with you. Today, I'm going to briefly go through just the last little bit of notes that I wanted to get through regarding components of the brain. There were, I think, 5 components that I didn't quite get to in yesterday's lesson that I will mention today and talk about their function in the notes. And then after I get through that, which should only be about 10 minutes here of this video, 10 to 15 minutes probably, then we are going to do part 2 of the speed dating activity. So if you don't already have this done, make sure that part 1 is complete. You should have had plenty of time to get this ready to go. I will explain how part 2 is going to work once we get there, but that'll be what we do with the second half of class today. All right, so I'm going to jump back into the notes where we left off and go through the information that we didn't quite get to regarding different brain components. So this is about where we left off last time. We were talking about the cerebral cortex and the different lobes of the brain. So frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. I showed you this image, and that's as far as we got. So today we are going to talk about 5 other components of the brain, and sometimes some of these are called association areas because unlike some of the other ones, the other components have specific locations in the brain. These ones are a little bit more inside of other locations. So the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex, they are actually going to be found here at the back of the frontal lobe. That's where the motor cortex is. And the somatosensory cortex is found at the front of the parietal lobe. So technically they are their own components, but at the same time they are a part of another component. So the motor cortex, which one of you is for the speed dating activity that we will do, or 2 of you are, this is at the back of the frontal lobe. And given that the word motor is in it, its major responsibility is to control voluntary movement, voluntary muscle movement. So I'll show you again on this image over here. The motor cortex has different portions kind of that's almost mapped out along the top of your cortex. And as shown in this image up here, it's kind of a weird image. Different parts of your body are controlled by different parts of your motor cortex. So in fact, if you wanted to, you could come in, or if a brain surgeon was in here and they used an electrode and they, zapped like a specific part, let's say like your thumb portion right here, which would be maybe like right about here, a person's thumb would actually kind of move in reaction to the electronic or to the electrode happening. So it's kind of interesting. The motor cortex here controls those specific parts of muscle movement. One thing that I will note here, and this will make sense, especially once we talk about something called the corpus callosum, which I'll get into in about 2 to 3 slides. The motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex, they follow what's called contralateral control. So contralateral, contra means kind of across, and lateral meaning, or I should say contra means opposite, and then lateral meaning the side. So opposite side control. So the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body, and the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body. So this motor cortex here, if I'm waving with my left hand, which I'm doing right now, even though none of you can see me, that is being controlled actually by my right motor cortex on the right side of my frontal lobe. And then vice versa, if I'm moving my right hand, that's going to be controlled by my left motor cortex. So for whatever reason, it kind of works opposite like that. In class on Monday, we'll also take a closer look at this guy that's had his corpus callosum split so that he can't have contralateral control. And I'll show you what happens there, or the communication doesn't happen the way it's supposed to. The somatosensory cortex, that is right behind the motor cortex here, and that is related to sensation. So sensory is in here. So somatosensory is referring to registering and processing body movement and touch. So this is right at the front of the parietal lobe. And basically you have all of these different parts of your body that have nerves that connect to, your eyes, your face, your jaw, your neck, your thorax, etc. And all of this information that's here is being registered in the somatosensory cortex. So technically speaking, when you touch the desk that you are touching as you listen to this lecture right now, that is actually being registered in the somatosensory cortex, not in your fingertips. All the information comes in. So that's the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex. I'll get off this image in a second here. I know this looks super weird, but The homunculus is this thing that psychologists have put together to show the amount of information dedicated in your somatosensory cortex towards different parts of your body. So, in other words, the reason this dude has super big hands like he does is because your hands have tons of nerve endings on it. So, the amount of square area that your somatosensory cortex is devoted towards nerve endings in your fingers and on your hands is very high compared to, let's say, like your elbow. Same with mouth and tongue, right? He's got a very big mouth, very big tongue, because again, on this image here, there's a lot of sensation that happens in the mouth and tongue. So this would make sense. I mean, this is the reason I always say, when we greet each other, we use our hands or we hug each other, or if it's an intimate another person, you would potentially kiss them. Humans aren't walking up to each other and rubbing backs against each other, elbows. Why? Well, because there's not a lot of sensation there. So the more sensation means that the more you can actually feel those areas. And that's the idea behind the homunculus here. Not that you need to know that for any test related purposes. Just make sure you understand the difference between the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex. Okay, other association areas. So association areas are areas of your cerebral cortex that are technically not parts or components, like I said already, but they're still involved in different parts of our learning, thinking, speaking, etc. So two other examples other than the somatosensory cortex, motor cortex, would be the Broca's area and Wernicke's area. So this is two other ones that two of you will have, or four of you will have, for the speed dating activity. The Broca's area is involved with language production, and the Wernicke's area is involved with understanding language. I think I have a picture of each one here. It's not a great image, but it is on your left temporal lobe here. The Wernicke's area is in your left temporal lobe, and the Broca's area is right where the left temporal lobe meets the left frontal lobe. So the Broca's area is involved with language production, Wernicke's area with language understanding. The way that I encourage my students to try to remember the difference here, and it's not the best analogy, but in English, we would say that if someone speaks broken English, that would mean that they kind of have a hard time speaking the language fluently. So broken sounds like broca, and it's the way they speak. So they speak a broken English, broken. That's the language production, the way they speak. Wernicke's area is what you are all using right now as you're listening to this video to understand the words that are coming out of my mouth. So that's the Wernicke's area, and it's associated with understanding language. We'll talk more about these later. We'll actually do an entire day devoted towards language when we study cognitive psychology. There's some really fascinating stuff that we'll learn about how our brain develops an understanding of language, as well as how we produce language. So we'll talk more about that later. Brain plasticity, this isn't a component of the brain, but it is something worth mentioning here. So our brain has all these different components. If you do damage to a specific part of your brain is not like forever lost without those abilities. So this is especially true during childhood. If you have like childhood brain trauma, and you lose a chunk of your brain or it's damaged, your brain can actually kind of alter where it can rewire itself so that the brain can pick up the slack for other parts that are missing. So like when Phineas Gage lost this chunk of his frontal lobe, he could still do some planning and thinking, even if it was altered. Other parts of his brain can pick up that job responsibility. And it also is all about creating new neurons and new rewiring. Okay. Okay, last slide quickly here. I'll pick up with this next time, but I'll mention this one just because the corpus callosum is the last part of the brain that we haven't talked about. So I want to make sure that that is out there so that all of the parts of the brain will be something that you have a general awareness of as you do this speed dating activity. So you do have two halves of your brain, right? There's a left hemisphere and there's a right hemisphere. It is connected by this band of fibers down the middle here called the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum connects the two hemispheres. So it acts as like a bridge between the left side and the right side. It allows for this contralateral control I mentioned before, where the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body and the right side of the brain controls the right side of the body. There is some specificity into what the left hemisphere versus right hemisphere is responsible for. And we'll talk more about this next class. I'll start off with this next time. But the left brain is more responsible for language, is one thing that's specifically found within left brain function. And so we'll talk more about that later, but that would be where you find the Broca's area and Wernicke's area. And the right side of your brain is more so for making big picture inferences, seeing the whole picture, and also facial recognition. We're going to next time watch this. Let's talk about those pictures next time too. We'll talk about this guy, Michael Gazzaniga, and some of his brain research on left and right hemispheres. We'll watch this video next time. He's got some really interesting stuff, but that'll be next Monday. But again, the corpus callosum is the name of this band of fibers right down the middle that connects the left and right hemispheres and allows for that contralateral control and communication between each sides of the hemisphere. Okay, so that is it for those last couple brain components: corpus callosum, Broca's and Wernicke's area, and motor cortex and somatosensory cortex. So at this point, you would have now learned about all of the different brain components that you're going to need to know for our test. And they're listed at the bottom of this worksheet here, actually. So all of them are here for you as a reference. Here is how we are going to do the speed dating activity. So normally, if I was in person, I would have set up the room where you guys would be kind of lined up with desks facing each other all around the room. But because I obviously am not in, I didn't reshape the room. So I'm going to have this happen a little bit more disorganized, and hopefully it still works. So what you're going to do, if you did a paper copy of this, make sure you have the paper copy out. If you have a Google Doc open, you're just going to be carrying around your Chromebook as you walk around the room. Basically, what you're going to do is you're going to be sharing your information from step one up here. I should say from part one. Specifically, you are sharing this information. Do not share the name of your brain component and what it does, because that kind of defeats the purpose. You're sharing your profile instead. So what was your fake name? You're going to share a pickup line if you have one, but again, that was optional. Remember, you don't need to do that. And then the 3 things that you wrote down that you like or dislike. So I will be, if I was you, I would be standing up here in a moment, making eye contact with somebody across the room and heading over to them in a second here to share my information from this section here, step 2. As I share my information, my partner that I'm sharing with is going to be writing down information in the date number 1 spot. So where it says fake name, what did they share their fake name was? For highlights, what are the likes and dislikes the person has? And then this is optional at the bottom here. Do you have a guess of what the brain component might be? You can reference the 3rd page if you want to, but based on what you're hearing them share with you, do you have a decent guess of what you think they might be? But the key thing is you want to make sure you get down the 3 likes, dislikes. So record the information, the highlights, as well as their fake name. Okay. And then after I share, my partner will share, and then I write down my partner's information. After a couple minutes, once we're both done, we'll move on, make eye contact with a second person, write down information for a second date, et cetera, et cetera. And you'll go on a 3rd date, 4th date, 5th date, et cetera, until you ultimately find your match. So you'll know you find your match, hopefully, because when you're sharing this information, you'll see some similarities. You'll find out that they like or dislike similar things. Maybe their fake name is somehow similar. And if you guess, hey, are you, the reticular formation, which is the example I've been using this whole time through these videos. And if they say, yeah, I am, then you'd be like, okay, I am too. Cool. All right. And then you can be done. So you don't need to fill out the entirety of this second sheet, right? I think I put down there's a possibility of 16 dates, which would be a ton. You just need to keep going until ultimately you find your match. Now, one thing to note on this, I believe in most of my classes, there's at least one set of 3. So there's a threesome. So it could be the case that if you find your match, you can just like sit down next to that person and you can wait while other people go around and continue this process. But there might be one lone person at the end. And it could be the case that they don't find their match simply because they don't realize that the people that are done with this process might actually be their match. So there is a possibility that you're in a set of 3. And I think maybe what I'll do is I'll shoot an email to those people and let them know that they're going to be in a set of 3, so that you know that you need to find not just one other person, but there's actually going to be 2 other people that have your same brain component. Okay. And then once you do find your match, however many dates it takes you, and you fill out that information, you're going to write down who your match is, what the actual name is. And I have a list of what everybody's brain component is, so I will know whether or not you're right or wrong with this information, but hopefully you'll all get this right. So that's the plan. When you are done with this, you can submit it on Google Docs, or if you're doing a paper copy, just make sure you have your name on this on the top and you got everything filled out on page one and however many dates you had, as well as who your actual match is. And then we will be done for today. And on Monday, when I see you guys again, we will continue on in our look at the brain and talking about some other information and kind of recap how this brain speed dating activity works. So hopefully it really works out. Shoot me an email if you got any questions or any thoughts. Yeah, I'll see you guys next week. Thanks.